We'll start our discussion of dynamic blind defense with a structural analysis of the small blind response to a positional opening raise. The structure of the game, by which we mean the forced blind payments and the dependence of action ordering upon the position of the player, gives rise to starkly different game trees depending on whether we're in the small blind or the big blind. This lecture is going to outline the differences in range construction which arise as a consequence of those differences in structure. It will serve as a formal prelude to the more practical lectures which follow. Let's start with an outline of the structure. The table on the right indicates, or the graphic on the right, indicates a single factor metric, which is the equity against a button open, and how we will break down our ranges, or break down our entire preflop range, into different actions depending upon this equity against that button open. So when we're facing a raise in the big blind, we only have to evaluate each hand in our preflop range against a single opponent's range. The set of post-flop situations is well defined, and so we construct our range as follows. We use a value 3-bet range composed of high equity hands with some lower equity hands with excellent polarity included. We'll be discussing polarity in a lot of detail later. Suffice to say for now, it's roughly interpreted as a measure of how large a pot our hands can tolerate when they hit the flop well and how often that happens. So it's a skewness of the equity distribution. We're also going to use a complementary 3-bet range, which is composed of lower equity hands, so hands which wouldn't usually qualify purely as a value 3-bet, but those which are very strong on the boards which our value 3-bet range is weakest. Notice this is going to be highly contingent upon the width and the structure of our opponent's open. If he's opening from under the gun and we 3-bet him with, for example, an ace-ace heavy value 3-bet range, then we're not going to need to protect our range to hit boards like 6-4-3, because our opponent quite simply won't have sets there himself. He won't have 5-7 or 5-deuce with any real frequency, and so we don't need to defend those boards, we will need to defend higher boards. We also have a calling range in the big blind, which is composed of hands with sufficient equity to have a profitable call, but not enough to have a value 3-bet, and all of those hands which didn't 3-bet or call end up in the folding range, which is composed of hands which don't have the sufficient equity even to justify a call. In the small blind, things are a bit more complicated. So we have to evaluate the quality of a hand which we enter the pot with against two alternative common scenarios. A 3-way 2-bet pot, which is when we call in the small blind and the big blind overcalls, and a heads-up 3-bet pot, which is when we 3-bet from the small blind, the big blind folds, and the button calls. Additionally, you should know that there are a couple of other scenarios which will occur slightly less frequently than these. One of them is if we 3-bet and the big blind cold flats, and then we could end up also with the button overcalling and then a three-way 3-bet pot, with at least us as the initiator. And then the other scenario is that we could call in the small blind and then be squeezed by the big blind. And you have to consider, for example, mild blocker factors in reducing the probability of that happening, particularly, of course, when we're going to hold an ace or a king ourselves, depending on quite how frisky the big blind is. And also you need to consider how the hand is then going to play. Like, would it qualify as being able to call the 3-bet anyway? But by and large, we're going to run into these two scenarios most commonly. So a really common mistake is just to describe a small blind 3-bet as a linear range. And if you're literally just like 3-betting the very best hands down to a certain end percentage here, you're going to end up with a range that really isn't very well constructed at all. So it's best it's a simplification, and at worst it's utterly misleading. By profitable, we're going to be discussing here like better than losing half a big blind per 100. The hands in the complementary range will of course be backed up by our value range, and so they just need to be doing better by virtue of 3-betting than they would be by virtue of folding. So we're going to build this complementary 3-bet range in a different way, taking into account three factors. We're going to take into account the equity threshold to call into a 3-way pot, so we're going to work out some equity threshold by which a hand qualifies to just play at all. We're going to take into account the equity edge heads up in a 3-bet pot. So is it the case, for example, we effectively get a promotion of the value of our hand by 3-betting it because our relative share of the pot improves by dint of having eliminated a player? And we're also going to consider the hand strength on the weakest defensible boards for our value 3-bet range, and that's going to matter a lot from blinds versus button, small blind versus button in particular, because of the fact that he can cover, well, more is the wrong word, but he can cover a more diverse set of flop textures than we can when we have this value 3-bet range, which will necessarily have a high range focus early on. And so there's this interplay where a hand might not quite qualify by pure equity thresholds to call in the small blind, but it may still qualify as a complementary 3-bet heads up, and that's a massive gain. So 3-betting, knotting in the big blind out, that's a massive gain compared to just folding and otherwise losing half a big blind per 100. So let's have a quick outline of the consequences of this structure of a calling ranges in the small blind. So a naive pot odds model, which hopefully most of you watching this series and beyond now would consider calling from the small blind primarily based on the discount it gets to participate in the anticipated 3-way pot. And we prefer to use a structural model to understand the situation. If you have pre-flop principles from PokerMath 2020, then you'll be very familiar by now with the need to use a tight opening range from under the gun. Now, when we call from the small blind, our expected post-flop situation is structurally similar to opening first in, but opening first in with the prior knowledge that you'll be playing out of position against two opponents and have no fold equity. Now, there is an interesting argument here with regards how certain hands play, which is that if when you're opening from under the gun you knew that you would not face a 3-bet, even if you knew that two players would be calling in position, you could argue that certain hands would still be valuable enough to open. But I think in practice, when you're calling from the small blind, you still do, yes, your best case scenario actually is playing a 3-way pot out of position against two players usually, and you still do face this threat of a squeeze from the big blind. So this is a very, very structurally similar situation to opening on the under the gun, knowing that you have no fold equity, and that would naturally reduce your opening range. And that's a good way of you kind of quantifying, if you're really quite green at this, quantifying what width you should be expecting to play from the small blind. You should be expecting to play very few hands with a pure call from the small blind. With no fold equity, we of course require a definite equity edge to justify entering the pot purely based on the value of a hand, because we've got a positional disadvantage, and so we should need more equity pre-flop to be able to do as well as our opponents are going to be doing post-flop. So when we call from the small blind facing a single raiser, we of course expect the big blind to overcall with a very high frequency. If we call a button open in particular, we face that additional threat of the high frequency squeeze, whereas if we're facing an under the gun middle position or cutoff open, presuming that this is a relatively tight cutoff open, not someone opening 45% or something, those are much better protected from squeezes, since the initial raiser has a large fraction of very strong pairs in his range, and so that threat of aces in particular is high from the perspective of the big blind, so we're not going to face a squeeze as often. So the single most important factor in our metric for evaluating for a call from the small blind is the equity of a hand in an anticipated 3-way pot. But this 3-way statement, or part of the statement, is especially important because suit domination is going to be less of a concern from the small blind compared with a potential middle position or cutoff call, precisely because the probability of a 4+ way pot is 0. So again, if you're joining me having watched pre-flop principles, you're aware there that I showcase the probability of a suit being dominated by a given rank depending on how many players are in the pot. And whilst running into a 3-way pot is of course worse than running into a heads-up pot, you only really get this very strong degeneration of hands like queen high flush draws, in fact even king high flush draws, but certainly queen and jack high flush draws once you start hitting the 4-way mark, and also especially when one of the ranges is tighter. So if someone's opening from the button, the concern about, oh, is my suit under threat here, happens at a much lower rank suit than if somebody's open from under the gun. Whereas if you're considering a call from middle position or cutoff, not only do you have more players left to act, which can make you likely to play in a 4+ way pot, but also there's a high probability of you facing the squeeze in the first place. So this is where there are actually some advantages to being in the small blind in terms of constructing our calling ranges. Let's have a brief digression on 3-betting for value, and 3-betting for value is going to be deeply explored with a number of different opening ranges in this series, so this is more of an overview. The question would be, should we widen the 3-bet value range in the small blind? So should I be giving you a 3-bet value range for the big blind and 3-bet value range for the small blind and have them be distinct and separated and then do the complementary range work? Or can we justify keeping just this single blind's value range? So the arguments for widening the 3-bet value range would be mainly that we can eliminate the big blind pre-flop, so there's more dead money, so shouldn't we just 3-bet more often? And also because there are lots of hands that would rather play with a marginal edge heads up out of position than with a greater edge in terms of raw absolute terms, 3 ways out of position. So there's a lot of benefit to not permitting the big blind to realize any equity whatsoever. So those two arguments on their own sound pretty good. Unfortunately, well, perhaps fortunately, if you don't want to 3-bet especially wide, there are some decent arguments against. And so the arguments against 3-betting a wider value range in the small blind are that the big blind is still left to act, and so the probability of running into a strong hands just goes up. So if you're 3-betting from the big blind against a single open, you already know that there's just that player left in the pot, whereas if you're in the small blind, there's the big blind who you have no information about whatsoever in terms of his range. Maybe if you're playing live, you can see that he's already throwing his hand away, but on an online game, you're not going to be privy to that information. Or at least I certainly hope not. So the probability of facing a 4-bet is also going to go up, right? If we get 3-bet wider for value and then maybe 4-bet wider from 4-bets more frequently because the big blind could wake up with a hand. And we will sometimes play a 3-way 3-bet pot out of position. So we'll sometimes 3-bet and the big blind will stubbornly overcall us. It could be good if he's a very big fish, but in terms of widening our value range, so be careful, make the right adjustments to the right table. But if it's just a competent player who's aware that if you're 3-betting wider, you may end up losing some of your fold equity because you're 3-betting too much. So our pre-flop fold equity is going down. In principle, the big blind can squeeze wide for value against our small blind calling range when he knows that we 3-bet wider for value ourselves. So it would be remiss of me not to mention this. In practice, I think that difference is marginal because the calling range is going to be strong and of limited width. So I don't think that if our opponent knows that we're 3-betting wider for value, he will necessarily squeeze a lot. But it can happen, and of course it has a very natural counter that if your opponent is perceiving you to be calling too wide in the small blind and his response is to just start squeezing any pair jacks or above, well, start cold flatting some big pairs, and you're going to have the money rolling quite quickly. So it's a relatively easy thing to counter, but do be aware of that interplay between if you 3-bet certain hands, then that takes them out of your calling range by definition, which can result in some quite weak calling ranges from whatever the side of the table the error is committed. So for the purposes of this course, I have taught the same core 3-bet value range for both the small blind and the big blind as a function of the width of the pre-flop open. So you should adjust your value range according to the table conditions, and we're going to use the factors that I discussed on that previous slide in your metric. So if the big blind folds too much when you 3-bet from the small blind, you can and should 3-bet wider for value. I've also added some hands to the small blind 3-betting range, which become profitable if they can eliminate the big blind as they play better in a heads-up pot, and there is some extra dead money present pre-flop. So this is not so much linearly widening the 3-bet value range, more as to having an additional complementary class of hands, which you're 3-betting them and they're not especially great heads up, but if you were to call them, they really wouldn't play very well, they'd weaken your range. So we're adding them more as a type of complementary hand rather than the pure value hand, even if they happen to have a small equity edge against the button pre-flop. So this section is actions for winners, and you're going to see these sequentially in each of the presentations. They are the actions that I think that you should take now in order to maximize your learning from what we've just covered. So take a couple of moments now to test yourself, because it's easy to assume that just because you understand a lecture, you now know the contents. This is an opportunity for you to both take some notes and also make sure you retain what you have learned. And the questions which follow are functional, and they're designed to test your practical knowledge of the concepts discussed. So either write up or type up answers to these questions. The first one is, why are we less concerned about suit domination when we are considering calling from the small blind than when we are in middle position? And the second question is, if you expect the big blind to squeeze aggressively when you call a button open from the small blind, how should your 3-bet value range change? You can answer both of those questions using the material in this lecture. If you find yourself a bit hazy or a bit hesitant, I recommend you either now or later go back and rewatch this lecture, and you'll find the answers not precisely to the questions explicitly stated necessarily, but you'll find what you need to know to answer those questions there. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture on dynamic blind defense. I'll see you in the next lecture. Thanks for watching.